The ballroom at the Metropolitan Grand Hotel glittered with chandeliers that threw clean white light onto marble floors, the kind of light that makes everyone look expensive and far away. Ethan Cole stood at the center of it, tall in a tailored suit, irritation flashing across his face like heat. When the small girl stepped forward, people barely noticed at first. She was 12, black, wearing a simple blue dress with a hem that had been repaired by hand. Her braids were neat and close to her scalp, and her hands shook at her sides, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what she was about to say. Ethan's eyes narrowed as if the room had been interrupted by a fly. He asked who let her in. Someone laughed. Another voice whispered about where her mother was. Jasmine Carter lifted her chin anyway and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even her. She said she could interpret Dutch. Ethan looked down at her like she had told a joke and asked how much she wanted for the service. Jasmine did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the cameras or the security near the door. She thought of a number that had been echoing in her home for days, and she said it plainly, $600. Ethan's laugh rolled out across the room, loud and sharp, the laugh of a man used to watching people shrink. He leaned in and told her he could buy her whole neighborhood with what he spent on lunch, and the executives around him chuckled into their hands, relieved to follow his lead. Jasmine felt her mother's grip tighten on her arm from somewhere behind her, a quiet plea to stop, to leave, to disappear. Security started forward. Then Jasmine did something the room did not expect. She turned her face past Ethan, past the laughter, toward the calm man, waiting at the far end of the table, Willem Van Dijk, the Dutch investor everyone had been scrambling to please. And Jasmine spoke to him in Dutch, her pronunciation clean, her rhythm patient, the words landing like a switch being flipped. The laughter died so fast it felt swallowed. Van Dyke straightened in his chair, studying her, the way a musician studies a new instrument. Ethan's smile faltered, then froze, because for the first time in that ballroom, he could not control the story with volume or money. 3 hours earlier, Jasmine had been sitting on the edge of her bed in a small apartment where rain tapped the window like a nervous habit. An old radio sat on her nightstand, faded brown plastic, her father's radio, the last thing of his that still made sound. She turned the dial slowly, listening for foreign stations, listening the way he taught her to listen for the heartbeat inside a language. In the kitchen, behind a thin wall, her mother Denise's voice had cracked on the phone, begging for one more week, promising the rent, repeating the same number until it felt like prayer. $600. If they did not pay by Friday, they would have to leave. Jasmine lay awake afterwards, staring at the ceiling cracks and thinking about what her father always said, that your value is not what people decide to give you. It is what you decide you are worth. Now, in the hotel's cold light, Jasmine stood alone in the center of a world that wanted to pretend she did not belong, and she was about to prove exactly what she could do. Denise Carter's phone rang just after lunch, the kind of ring that made her shoulders tighten before she even picked up. She stood in their narrow kitchen, one hand on the counter where yesterday's mail still sat in a crooked stack, and listened as her supervisor spoke fast and tired. A conference downtown. Documents needed right now. No one else available. Denise looked toward the bedroom where Jasmine was folding a worn sweater with the careful focus of a kid who learned early that neatness was a kind of control. Denise covered the receiver and sighed, then said softly that Jasmine would have to come along and that she needed her to stay quiet, to stay close, to not touch anything. Jasmine nodded without arguing, but her eyes flicked to the calendar on the wall where Friday was circled in pen, and she could almost hear her mother's voice from the night before, cracking on the phone, repeating $600, like it was a lock combination that might open a door. Jasmine put on her best dress, the blue one, with a small tear near the hem that she had stitched herself with thread that never quite matched, and she braided her hair the way her father used to, two clean rows that made her feel steady. Outside, the rain had eased into a thin mist, and the street smelled like wet concrete and bus exhaust. On the ride downtown, Denise stared out the window as if she could will the city to soften, and Jasmine watched buildings rise taller and cleaner glass, replacing brick like the air itself got more expensive the closer they got to the hotel. The Metropolitan Grand Hotel sat like a polished stone in the middle of the block, its lobby bright and echoing, its floor so glossy, Jasmine could see her shoes and the frayed edge of her dress reflected back at her. Men in suits moved past without looking down. Women in silk spoke in low voices that carried a sharp confidence, and Jasmine felt that old familiar invisibility settle over her, the feeling of being present but not counted. Denise held her elbow as if to keep her from drifting into the wrong world. They rode the elevator up, and when the doors opened on the conference floor, the air changed again, cooler, scented with coffee and cologne. Denise delivered the envelope to a room where people talked in quick bursts, but the person who took the papers did not even check the label. He was a young assistant named Kyle Bennett, his tie slightly crooked, his phone clutched in his hand like it was already failing him. His eyes kept darting toward the main ballroom down the hall, where voices rose and fell in irritated waves. Denise asked what was happening, and Kyle gave a humorless laugh, the sound of someone watching a train slide toward a broken bridge. He said the biggest deal of the year was falling apart. Ethan Cole, the billionaire CEO. Everyone was there to impress, was trying to close an $80 million partnership with a Dutch renewable energy investor named Willem Van Dijk. Van Dijk had a rule, Kyle said, a strict rule for negotiations. He only spoke Dutch. It was not just preference. It was a test, a way of measuring whether people were serious enough to meet him where he stood. The company had hired a top interpreter, but she had been in a car accident about 30 minutes ago. Alive, Kyle said, but not coming. And now Van Dijk had announced he would leave in 10 minutes if no interpreter arrived. Kyle's voice lowered on the last part, like he could not believe the number was real. 10 minutes. Denise asked if they could find someone else, and Kyle shook his head, bitter and almost embarrassed. Dutch at a business level was rare. He said not like Spanish or French. Phones were ringing and going unanswered. People were sweating through their shirts in rooms that cost more per night than Denise earned in a week. Jasmine stood behind her mother, quiet, listening the way her father taught her to listen, not for volume, but for meaning. Dutch. The word landed in her chest like a bell. She knew Dutch. She knew it from late-night radio stations that came in like whispers from her father's dictionaries, with dog-eared pages from contracts and technical papers Denise brought home and could not read from years of learning the patience inside the language. Jasmine felt her heartbeat speed up, then slow down, as if her body was trying to decide whether to run or step forward. She looked at Denise, at the fine lines near her mother's eyes, at the way her mother's fingers always seemed slightly tense, like they were bracing for something. Denise thanked Kyle and turned toward the elevator, already thinking about getting back to work, about not attracting attention, about surviving until Friday. She tugged Jasmine's hand, but Jasmine's feet did not move. In the hallway, she could hear raised voices from the ballroom, the sound of expensive anger. In her mind, she saw the ceiling cracks in their apartment and the number 600 written across them like chalk. She thought of her father's voice, calm and sure, telling her that your value does not come from what people decide to hand you. It comes from knowing what you are worth. Denise pulled again, sharper this time. Her eyes worried, but Jasmine gently freed her hand and started walking toward the noise. Denise followed, stunned, calling her name. But Jasmine kept moving the way you move when you finally accept that fear is not going to pay the rent. The ballroom doors were open, and the room inside was chaos, dressed up as power. Men in tailored suits clustered in tense circles. Assistants hovered with tablets and tight smiles that did not reach their eyes. At the center stood Ethan Cole, face flushed, voice cutting through the air as he barked orders that no one could solve. At the far end, Willem Van Dijk sat calmly at a long table, checking his watch with the patience of a man who could afford to leave. Jasmine walked through the crowd, and people barely noticed her at first because children like her were trained to be background. Then she stopped directly in front of Ethan. He looked down with irritation and asked, "Who let this kid in here?" and told someone to get her out. Jasmine did not apologize. She did not plead. She simply said clear and steady that she could translate that she spoke Dutch. Ethan stared at her as if deciding whether to laugh or to explode. He asked how much she wanted, and Jasmine said $600. The room went still for half a beat. Then laughter broke out sharp and relieved, like they were grateful the pressure had found something smaller to land on. Denise pushed forward, face burning, whispering apologies, trying to pull Jasmine away. But Jasmine stayed planted. Ethan leaned in and said he could buy her whole neighborhood with what he spent on lunch, and the words were meant to shrink her, to remind her that this world belonged to him. Jasmine felt the pull of old shame, the instinct to disappear. but she turned her head away from Ethan and looked straight at Willem Van Dijk. And, in Dutch, in a clean, patient rhythm, she spoke directly to him, asking if he really wanted to walk away from a deal, because no one here could speak to him. The laughter stopped like a radio being switched off. Van Dijk's eyes narrowed as he studied her. Then his posture shifted, attentive, interested. Ethan's face changed, the arrogance slipping into something pale and tight, because now the room was listening to the girl he had tried to dismiss, and the story had moved beyond his control. The room did not breathe the way normal rooms breathe. It held its air like it was saving it for someone important. Willem Van Dijk leaned back in his chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on Jasmine as if he were testing the edge of a blade. His Dutch came back to her in a smooth, measured reply, asking where she learned to speak like that, where a child like her could have found such precision. Jasmine answered without hesitation, because the truth was the only thing she could stand on in a place built out of appearance. She said she learned from her father. She said he called Dutch the language of patience and precision. Van Dijk's mouth curved into a slow smile, the first warmth that had touched the ballroom all day, and he turned his head toward Ethan Cole, switching into accented English, just enough to make sure everyone heard. He said he accepted the girl. He said she spoke better Dutch than the last interpreters they had used. He checked his watch again, sharp and deliberate, and said they would begin now or he would leave. The words were not a threat, they were simply a fact, and that made them heavier. Ethan's jaw tightened so hard it looked painful. For a second, it was clear he wanted to crush the moment with money, or with anger to remind everyone who owned the room. But $80 million sat between him and humiliation, and the Dutchman had already pulled his chair forward. Ethan pointed at Jasmine like she was a tool that might break in his hand, and hissed that if she made one mistake, one single error, he would make sure she and her mother never worked in this city again. Denise's breath caught near the wall where she stood, frozen, her hands clasped together, as if prayer could keep her child safe. Jasmine nodded once. She did not promise to be perfect because she wanted to impress him. She promised because she already knew what she could do. She said she would not make a mistake. The meeting started like a storm, being contained inside polite sentences. Van Dijk spoke in rapid Dutch, the language sliding fast, dense with technical terms about infrastructure, carbon targets, technology transfer, profit sharing timelines, non-negotiable conditions. His tone carried quiet confidence, the confidence of someone who never had to chase. Jasmine listened not just for words but for intention, the way her father taught her to listen when the radio brought in foreign stations like faint ghosts. Then she translated into English with a steady voice that did not waver, capturing the exact meaning without softening it for comfort. When Van Dijk made a subtle joke about American business habits, Jasmine carried the humor across without turning it into flattery. When he expressed skepticism about long-term commitments, she delivered the skepticism clean. When he laid down a condition that could not be negotiated, she made it sound exactly as firm as it was. The executives around the table stopped whispering. Assistants who had been smirking earlier grew still, their eyes moving between the girl and their boss as if watching a miracle they were not allowed to celebrate. Ethan responded with sharp English, pushing back, demanding concessions, talking like a man used to winning by volume. Jasmine translated him into Dutch with the same discipline, preserving his aggression and his intent, not smoothing his edges, not saving him from himself. The room began to shift, not dramatically, but in small physical ways. A pen stopped tapping. A phone stayed in a pocket. A security guard stepped closer, curious despite himself. And for Ethan, something more dangerous than the deal began happening. His attention started drifting away from the numbers and toward the girl's face, her focus. The way she stood straight despite being surrounded by men who could buy her whole building without noticing. Her eyes sharp and calm, like she was looking through the room rather than at it. It stirred a memory he did not want. A small kitchen decades ago, wallpaper peeling, the sound of a sewing machine late at night, fabric scraps piled like little defeated flags. His mother exhausted but fierce, bending over a dress she was finishing for a woman who would never learn her name. Ethan had been a boy at that table, hungry and embarrassed, asking why they could not just ask someone for help. His mother had looked at him with tired eyes that still burned, and she said, "You do not need anyone to give you opportunities. You create them with your own value." Never let anyone tell you what you are worth. You decide. He had believed her then. He had carried those words through school, through his first job, through the years when he built his company with clenched teeth and sleepless nights. But somewhere along the climb, the words got buried under better suits and bigger rooms. He started measuring people the way investors measure risk, and he told himself it was just business. Now, watching Jasmine translate with that same stubborn dignity his mother once carried, he felt something crack behind his ribs, a thin wall he had built to keep his old life from touching him. The meeting kept moving. Van Dijk pushed terms forward like stones on a board. Ethan countered. Jasmine bridged the gap with language so precise it felt like architecture. And Ethan realized with a discomfort that turned his stomach that he had laughed at her earlier because he needed her to be small. If she stayed small, he stayed safe. If she stayed small, he did not have to see how far he had drifted from the boy at the kitchen table. Across the room, Denise watched her child do the impossible, tears slipping down her cheeks without permission. She looked terrified, proud, and confused all at once because she had spent years trying to protect Jasmine from rooms like this, and now Jasmine was standing in the center of it, holding the whole room together with nothing but her voice. The negotiation rolled toward its end, and the tension in the air started to loosen in cautious increments. People began to exchange glances that said this might actually work. Ethan kept his face hard, but inside he was watching a different deal unfold, one he did not know how to price. A child was showing him the shape of integrity, not loudly, not with speeches, just by doing the work cleanly and refusing to bend. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan could not tell whether he wanted the deal more than he wanted to stop feeling ashamed. The ballroom began to empty the way a storm drains off a street, slow at first and then all at once. Voices dropped into satisfied murmurs. Phones came out. People stepped into the hallway already talking about the win, already rewriting the panic from 10 minutes ago into a story where they had always been in control. Willem Van Dijk rose from his chair, buttoned his jacket, and offered Ethan Cole a firm handshake that looked polite on the surface but felt like a verdict underneath. He praised the partnership in short, efficient sentences, then glanced at Jasmine as he passed, giving her a single nod that carried more respect than the whole room had shown her when she walked in. He told Ethan in accented English that the girl was remarkable and that he should hire her permanently. Then he left with his assistants leaving behind, a quiet that felt too big for the space. Ethan watched the last of the executives file out, watched the door swing closed, and for the first time all day, the ballroom felt like it belonged to only 3 people. Ethan, Jasmine, and Denise. Denise stood near the wall with her hands pressed together like she was afraid any sudden movement might shatter what had just happened. Jasmine stood in the center with her hands clasped in front of her, calm in a way that did not look like confidence so much as certainty. Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. His motions were practiced smooth, the way a man moves when he has solved problems with money for most of his adult life. He counted out bills without looking, then held a thick stack toward Jasmine. $6,000, he said. His voice tried to sound generous, even kind, but there was still a hint of control inside it, the reflex of someone offering more. So the other person feels smaller. He told her she earned more than what she asked for. Denise's breath hitched, because $6,000 was not just a number. It was a year of rent in their world. It was groceries without counting. It was sleeping without fear for months. Jasmine looked at the stack of bills, and for a second the room tightened again, not with business tension, but with something more personal. The air felt like the moment before a decision you cannot take back. Then Jasmine shook her head. She said she only needed $600. That was her price. Ethan's expression flickered, confused and annoyed at the same time, as if he had offered a gift, and the child had insulted him by not wanting it. He told her not to be foolish. He said $6,000 could change her life. Jasmine met his gaze without flinching. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform bravery. She simply said $600 would save her home. That was all she asked for. That was all she would take. Ethan leaned forward, the impatience returning, and asked if she understood she was turning down $5,400. He called it ridiculous, but Jasmine's face stayed steady. She reminded him quietly that she told him her price before they started. He agreed. Now she expected him to honor it. Ethan stared at her like she had spoken in a language he had forgotten. In 30 years, no one had refused his money. People always wanted more. They begged for donations, investments, sponsorships. They praised him, spun stories about his generosity, took whatever he offered, because it was safer to accept than to challenge. This child wanted less. It made him feel exposed. Why he demanded, and the word came out harder than he intended, almost angry, because he could not understand why someone standing in front of him would choose fairness over advantage. Jasmine paused for a beat, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted her words to be clean. She said her father used to tell her that when someone gives you more than you asked for, you should ask yourself why. She said people who give to control are not really giving. They are buying. She looked at the money in his hand like it was just paper, not power, and she said she was not for sale. She sold him her skill for 1 hour. The price was $600, nothing more. The sentence hit Ethan like a shove to the chest. He felt his throat tighten. He heard his mother's voice in his head, sharp and familiar, saying, almost the same thing, that your worth is not determined by what others pay you. It is determined by knowing what you are worth and never accepting less. Ethan had spent decades accepting more. More money, more influence, more control. He told himself accumulation was success. That wealth was victory, that the world respected only what it could price. But standing in front of a 12-year-old girl in a repaired blue dress, he realized he had been buying people his entire adult life. Buying their loyalty, buying their respect, buying their silence. He had grown so used to transactions that he forgot what integrity looked like. And here it was, small and unshakable, asking only for what was owed. Ethan's hand trembled. He tried to speak and his voice cracked. He said he was trying to help her. Jasmine answered gently that she did not ask for help. She asked for payment. There was a difference. The words were simple, but they split something open in him. He thought about all the times he had used money to avoid discomfort, to smooth over guilt, to make himself feel like the hero of other people's stories. He thought about his mother, about how he missed her funeral because he was closing a deal, how he never visited her grave, how he buried her lessons under boardrooms and headlines. He swallowed hard and said his mother was like her. Denise stepped forward instinctively, protective, unsure what was happening, but sensing danger in a powerful man unraveling. Jasmine stayed still. Ethan pushed through the next words like they were heavy. He said his mother never took charity, never asked for more than she earned, and she died, believing he would be someone she could be proud of. He looked down, shame moving across his face like a shadow, and said he did not think she would recognize him now. The ballroom was silent again, but this time it was not the silence of embarrassment. It was the silence of truth being spoken without decoration. Jasmine's voice came soft and steady. She said her father used to tell her it is never too late to become who you were supposed to be. Maybe his mother would say the same. Ethan closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. He looked at the money in his hand as if it were suddenly meaningless. Slowly, deliberately, he peeled 6 crisp $100 bills from the stack, folded them neatly, and held them out. 600, he said, quiet now, as agreed. Jasmine accepted the bills without counting. She tucked them into the pocket of her worn blue dress with the same calm she used all day, and she thanked him not with triumph, not with gloating, just the simple courtesy of a fair transaction completed. Ethan slipped the rest of the money back into his wallet, moving like a man learning a new rhythm. He turned to Denise, and his voice had lost its sharp edge. He said he would like to speak with her next week. He said his company needed people with genuine ability, not just impressive credentials. Denise blinked, stunned, and said she was just an assistant, that she answered phones and delivered documents. Ethan looked at her and said she raised this child, and that told him more than any resume ever could. He pulled out a plain business card, white with black ink, and placed it in Denise's hand. He told her to call Monday morning and ask for his personal assistant. He said both of them could come if they wanted. Denise asked why, because the question was too big to hold. Ethan did not reach for corporate explanations this time. He said Jasmine reminded him of something he forgot a long time ago. He told Denise to consider it, him paying a debt he did not know he owed. Then, in a move that shocked even him, he lowered himself to one knee so his eyes were level with Jasmine's. He apologized for laughing at her, for dismissing her, because she was young, and poor, for thinking he knew what value looked like. He admitted he was wrong. He spoke about his mother, about integrity, about how he forgot all of it, and became the kind of man she warned him about. A tear slid down his cheek, and he did not wipe it away. He told Jasmine his mother would have been proud of her. Jasmine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she paused, then said maybe his mother would be proud of him too if he started again. Something broke in Ethan. Then a sound that was half sob and half breath, raw and human. Jasmine stepped forward and placed her small hand on his shoulder, not as charity, not as pity, but as a simple sign that a person can be corrected without being destroyed. She told him it was okay, that the hardest part of changing is admitting you need to. He already did that. Ethan whispered thank you. Jasmine nodded once, then took her mother's hand. She told Denise they should go home. They had rent to pay. Denise laughed through tears and pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. As they walked out, their footsteps echoed on the marble floor and faded into the grand lobby. Later that night, back in their small kitchen, the $600 lay on the worn table like a tiny anchor holding them in place. Denise kept touching the bills as if they might disappear. Jasmine smiled and said her dad always told her, knowing your worth is the most powerful thing in the world. And she thought she finally understood. Outside, the city hummed sirens and car horns and neighbor arguments through thin walls, the same as always. But inside that apartment, something new had started. Not a fairy tale, not a sudden climb from poverty to wealth, just a door cracked open and a little light coming through. Jasmine rested her head on her mother's shoulder and asked if her dad would be proud. Denise kissed the top of her head and said she believed he had been proud every single day. Ethan Cole did not sleep much that night, and it was not because of the deal. The $80 million would be celebrated in the morning with headlines and handshakes and polished talking points, but the thing that kept him awake was smaller, quieter, and sharper. He kept seeing Jasmine Carter's face when she said she was not for sale, and he kept hearing the way she separated two words he had spent a lifetime blending together: help and payment. In the dark of his penthouse, the city lights looked like distant stars that belonged to someone else. He poured a drink he did not finish. He stood at the window and tried to remember the last time he felt proud without needing an audience. The answer did not come, only the sound of his mother's sewing machine in his memory, steady and relentless, like a heartbeat that refused to be bribed. By the time Monday morning arrived, Ethan was already dressed, already moving. But the old arrogance was not sitting on his shoulders the way it used to. It felt heavier now, like a coat he realized did not fit. At 9 on the dot, his assistant told him Denise Carter was on the line. Her voice small and careful, as if she expected the connection to drop or the offer to vanish. Ethan told his assistant to schedule a meeting in person, not a quick call. And he said to clear the hour like it mattered, because it did. When Denise arrived later that day, she stood in the lobby of Hailstone Energy's glass building with Jasmine beside her, both of them wearing the best they had, both of them trying to look like they belonged, without pretending they were someone else. Jasmine's blue dress had been pressed, the hem still repaired, the stitches still visible if you look close. Denise held her purse with both hands the way people do when they are used to defending what little they have. Security eyes followed them, and the receptionist's smile was practiced, but Ethan met them at the elevator himself before anyone could decide they were in the wrong place. He did not announce it. He simply showed up tall in a suit and pressed the button for the executive floor as if escorting them was the most normal thing in the world. Denise's eyes widened. Jasmine's face stayed calm, but her gaze tracked everything. The cameras, the badge scanners, the soft hum of air conditioning that made the building feel like it never sweated. In Ethan's office, the walls were clean and quiet, decorated with awards that suddenly looked like props to him. He offered them water. Denise declined out of habit, then accepted when Ethan set the glass down anyway, and sat across from her without the usual performance of power. He told Denise he had reviewed her file, not just the job title, but the work she did, that no one praised the overtime. The document runs the way she kept a household steady on an assistant's pay. He said he was not offering charity. He said he was offering a job because he needed someone who understood pressure without breaking someone who knew what it meant to be responsible when no one was watching. Denise blinked, still unsure where the trap might be, because people like Ethan did not usually open doors without wanting something back. Ethan acknowledged that out loud. He said he had spent years giving in ways that were really just buying. He said he did not want to do that anymore. He asked Denise what she wanted, not what she needed, but what she wanted. And Denise looked down at her hands as if the word itself was unfamiliar. She said she wanted stability. She wanted to pay rent on time. She wanted Jasmine to be a kid sometimes instead of a second adult. Ethan nodded like those were the most reasonable demands he had ever heard. Then he turned to Jasmine and asked her what she wanted. Jasmine answered in the same steady voice she used in the ballroom. She said she wanted to keep learning. She said she wanted to honor her father's work. She said she wanted to be treated fairly, not as a miracle and not as a mascot. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest because it was the same line she drew before the same refusal to be packaged for other people's comfort. He told her he respected that. He said he would not hire her as a child employee and he would not parade her around the company like proof of his generosity. He said if she ever chose to work with languages professionally, he would pay for proper training, proper credentials, and proper protection scholarships, mentorships, whatever she wanted, with contracts that made the terms clear and the power balanced. He said she could say no at any time. Denise's eyes filled again, not with desperation this time, but with relief she did not know how to carry. Ethan slid a folder across the desk with an offer for Denise, a salary that made her swallow hard benefits that sounded unreal, and a start date that left room for her to give notice with dignity. Denise hesitated, her old fear rising, the fear that accepting too much meant owing too much. Jasmine placed her hand lightly on her mother's wrist, a quiet reminder of what they had just lived through. That fairness is not the same as being bought. Denise took a breath and asked questions, careful questions, about hours, about duties, about whether this would put Jasmine under a spotlight she did not ask for. Ethan answered cleanly. He said he would not interfere with Jasmine's childhood. He said he would not use their story for marketing. He said he wanted to do one thing differently and let it stay different. When the meeting ended, Ethan walked them back to the elevator again. In the lobby, Denise held the folder like it was fragile, like paper could change a life if you held it the right way. Jasmine stepped into the sunlight outside and let the air hit her face warmer and more honest than the air inside the building. On the bus ride home, Denise kept looking at the offer as if the letters might rearrange themselves. Jasmine looked out the window at the city, passing by the same streets, the same cracked sidewalks, the same people carrying their own storms. She did not feel rich. She did not feel saved by a fairy tale. She felt something steadier than that. She felt heard. That evening in their small kitchen, Denise taped the offer letter inside a drawer, the way she used to hide rent money, not because she didn't trust it, but because she had learned to protect what mattered. Rain started again, light at first, then stronger, tapping the window with the same nervous rhythm as before. Jasmine turned on her father's old radio and let the static fill the room. For a moment, the sound of distance, the sound of possibility. Denise sat across from her, hands wrapped around a mug, and for the first time in a long time, her shoulders were not braced for impact. Jasmine did not speak a big lesson. She just looked at her mother and asked if they were going to be okay. Denise nodded slowly, tears shining but not falling, and said, "Yes, baby, I think we are." And in the quiet after that, Jasmine imagined her father's voice not as a ghost, but as a steady presence reminding her that value is not something you beg for, it is something you live one honest decision at a time. The weeks that followed did not feel like a movie montage. No sudden glow up, no magic elevator from struggle to comfort, just mornings that started with the same alarm and the same bus ride, but with a different kind of air in the apartment. Denise began her new job with hands that still shook a little when she walked through those glass doors, not because she was weak, but because she had lived too long in spaces where one wrong step could cost everything. On her first day, she arrived early the way people do when they are used to being underestimated, and she learned the building's rhythms, the security checkpoints, the quiet codes people used to decide who belonged. There were still looks, still moments where a smile felt like it was measuring her, but Denise held her posture the way she held rent money in her mind, carefully, deliberately, refusing to spill. At home, Jasmine's life did not become easy overnight, but it became clearer. She still did homework at the kitchen table, with the worn wood under her elbows, still listened to rain tick against the window when storms rolled in, still turned on her father's radio and searched for distant voices in languages that made her feel close to him. The difference was that Denise was no longer carrying everything alone, and Jasmine no longer felt like every talent she had was just another tool to keep the lights on. Ethan kept his distance the way he promised no photo ops, no speeches, no story turned into a corporate victory lap. When he offered support, it came with paperwork and boundaries, scholarship funds placed in a trust mentorship, contacts vetted carefully, decisions left in Denise's hands, and Jasmine's consent treated like law. The first time Denise received her paycheck, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the numbers until her eyes blurred. Then she paid the rent early, not because she wanted to show off, but because she wanted to feel what it was like to choose safety instead of begging for it. She put the receipt in a drawer and closed it like a ritual. That Friday, the one that used to feel like a cliff, passed quietly and nothing crashed. Jasmine noticed that more than anything. The world did not end. The air did not crack open. They stayed. On a Saturday morning, Denise took Jasmine to the library not because they needed free entertainment, but because they finally had space for something that was not emergency. Jasmine wandered the language section with her fingers running along spines, Dutch grammar guides, French novels, German newspapers on a rack that smelled like ink and dust. She checked out a book she did not need for survival, only for joy. And that felt like a new kind of power. Later that day, they visited a small cemetery on the edge of town, the kind with uneven grass and wind that carried the sound of distant traffic. Denise had not planned to tell Ethan, and she did not. This was theirs. Jasmine stood beside her mother and watched Denise place a small bouquet down, not for Ethan's mother, not for Ethan's guilt, but for the truth that had been hiding in all of this. People do not become hard because they are born cruel. They become hard because life teaches them to protect the hurt places. Denise looked at the name on the stone and said nothing, because sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is let silence speak. Jasmine understood. On the ride home, the bus rattled and the city slid past in gray blocks and storefronts, and Jasmine thought about that ballroom again, not with anger now, but with clarity. She realized the moment that changed everything was not when she spoke Dutch. It was when she named her price and refused to let anyone rewrite it. That was the line. Not greed, not pride, just self-respect drawn clean. That night, rain returned, tapping the window like it always did, and Jasmine turned on the radio, letting static fill the room until a faint Dutch broadcast surfaced like a distant lighthouse. Denise sat nearby folding laundry, moving slower than she used to, because she was no longer racing a deadline for disaster. Jasmine listened, then practiced a phrase under her breath, soft and careful like her father used to do. Denise looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that does not ask for permission. Jasmine asked her mother if she thought Ethan would really change, not because she cared about his reputation, but because she needed to believe the world could bend toward better without crushing somebody else. Denise thought for a long moment, then said change is not a speech. It is a habit, and habits take time. She said Ethan had started with the hardest part, seeing her, seeing them, seeing himself. The rest was on him. Jasmine nodded and let that be enough. Because the lesson she carried forward was not about a billionaire saving anybody. It was about a child refusing to be purchased, a mother refusing to fold, and a simple truth that can live in any neighborhood, any kitchen, any quiet night with rain on the glass. You can be poor and still be priceless. You can be young and still be right. You can stand in a room built to erase you and speak in a voice so steady it forces people to remember you. If you have ever had to name your worth while somebody tried to laugh it away, I want to hear from you. And if this story hit you in that place, drop a 1. If you believe knowing your worth is power, drop a 0. If you think the world will always try to set your price, and tell me what helped you hold your line.